Stunning revelations in the IRS scandal. We now know the official who was in charge of the IRS department that targeted conservative groups is now running the agency's Obamacare implementation office. And now one Republican congressman is introducing a bill that he says will keep the IRS from enforcing the president's health care law. Virginia Congressman Randy Forbes joins me this morning from Washington. Good morning to you, Congressman.
Good morning, Gretchen.
Either you have ESP or something else is going on here, because you introduced this bill long before the revelations of the IRS scandal, correct?
That's right, Gretchen. You just had Superman on your show, and even he's afraid of the Internal Revenue Service. You can imagine the rest of America. And one of the things we realize, it's not a single individual, it's a culture that does this. And the Internal Revenue Service is the most intimidating agency in the United States of America. We realized back in 2010 the problem this was going to have. We introduced the legislation. We couldn't get people to pay attention to it, but now we've got a lot of people copying it and saying, hey, it's time for us to get the IRS out of our health care.
So what are your what's your number one concern about the IRS being in charge of Obamacare?
Well, Gretchen, first of all, it is the power that the IRS has. It's different than any other agency, any other department. The IRS doesn't have to prove something against you. They can walk in and you've got the burden of proof. The second thing is we know there's a huge disconnect between the information they're legally entitled to get and what they actually get, and also a disconnect between how they can use that information and how legally they're supposed to use that information. We think hiring thousands of new agents and putting more and more information in their hands is a terrible thing for the American people. And when you see all these revelations that have come out over the last several weeks, it ought to frighten every American and at least give us pause to step back and say, put it somewhere else, but don't give all this power additionally to the IRS.
Well, what do you think about the fact that this woman who was in charge of the office that was targeting conservative groups was recently promoted to be in charge of the IRS's interaction for Obamacare? I mean,
Gretchen,
if she was targeting 470 conservative groups at last count, what about 50% of the American public that doesn't like Obamacare?
Gretchen, it's exactly the case. And as you realize, this is not a single individual. This is a whole culture. Look at, you don't do this with one or two individuals. This is a pattern I think we're going to find the more that we look into this. And to have her now in charge of this ought to be frightening to Americans, because it just shows how our rights are going to be jeopardized. And again, when you put this kind of power in a single agency or department, we start looking more and more like a third world country instead of the great democracy that we ought to be.
And just to remind viewers, we were going to give them, and still are, unless your bill goes through, $440 million in taxpayer money to the IRS to implement Obamacare.
And Gretchen, our bill takes all of that out.
All right. Congressman Randy Forbes, keep us abreast as to what happens. Thanks much.
Thanks, Gretchen.
Next on the rundown, she's